2.1 Theme 2 Communication. Lesson 2.1 Vocabulary for Listening. Communication Mediums. Benefits and Drawbacks. Exercise A1. Listen to some students working with Table 1. Fill in the information for posted letter.
OK, so we've got the example here for a posted letter. It is slow but cheap. What does the next bit mean?
Well, we have to consider convenience for the sender and for the receiver. It's not the same thing. Posting a letter is not very convenient for the sender.
Because you have to find a postbox or go to a post office.
Exactly.
Ah, right, I see. But it's very convenient for the receiver.
Well, only if there's a postal delivery. In my country, you have to go to a post office to collect your letters.
Right. So what about letter through a courier? What's a courier?
(2.2) Exercise B3. Listen and check your answers.
Convenience. Convenient. Inconvenient. Security. Secure. Insecure. Expense. Expensive. Inexpensive. Benefit. Beneficial. Useless. Scarcity. Scarce. Common. Complexity. Complex. Simple.
(2.3) Exercise C. Listen to some sentences. Number the words in the table above. 1,
Mobile phone calls can be very expensive.
2,
Email is very secure, even if you don't put your emails into code.
3,
The postal system is inconvenient if there is no home delivery.
4,
The speed of email is one of its main benefits.
5,
The mobile has largely replaced the fixed line phone because of its convenience.
6,
Letters are inexpensive, but very slow compared with email.
7,
Some people don't use email because they think it is too complex.
8,
You don't see many public phone boxes in some countries now. They are quite scarce.
(2.4) Lesson 2.2 Real-time listening, long-distance communication and business principles.
Everybody here? Yeah? Okay. I'm going to talk to you today about communication over long distances. It's quite an interesting subject in its own right, but we're not here to learn about smoke signals or telephones specifically. We are going to look at the history of long-distance communication to see what the modern business person can learn from it. History is a very good case study. Who said that? That's right, me. Right, okay. So first, a quick outline of the history of long-distance communication before the telephone. Then we'll see how basic business principles applied, even in those early days. And finally, we'll look at the development of the telephone in the light of these principles. So, where do we begin with the history of communication over long distances? Obviously, human beings have been able to communicate over short distances since ancient tribes in Africa and wherever first learned to speak. But unless you can shout very, very loudly, you cannot communicate with someone in the next town or city by using your voice. You need another medium of communication. First, we had things like smoke signals, I guess. They must be thousands of years old. People used to bang drums as well in some areas, I suppose. But this kind of signal only works over a few kilometres. People wanted a way of communicating over much longer distances. They couldn't use spoken language. That's the telephone. And, of course, that came much later. They had to use written language. As you probably know, the Sumerians invented writing in about 3000 BCE. That is over 5,000 years ago. Once people had a script, they could send a letter. In other words, they could write something down and give it to a messenger who could take it to someone in another town or even another country. Now, there is some evidence that the Sumerians sent written messages to each other, but we need to move on a couple of thousand years to the earliest recorded postal system. Now, that appeared in about 900 BCE. The Chinese invented it. Couriers carried messages around the country from the national leaders to their local rulers. They were diplomatic messages. In other words, not things like, having a lovely time, wish you were here. The messages didn't travel very fast. The couriers walked. So speed of transmission was about 8 kilometres an hour. They weren't very secure either. Thieves could stop a messenger and take the message from him. In about 150 BCE, the Egyptians started using horses to carry messages more quickly. Horses can go faster than people, but they cannot travel for very long carrying a person and the messages, of course. So the Egyptians set up a system of relay stations for messengers on horseback. Urgent messages now travelled at about 15 kilometres an hour for the next few thousand years. They still weren't secure, of course. Why is all of this important to the modern business person, I hear you ask? Why do I need to know all this rubbish? Well, let's go on a bit and then we'll see. We have to wait a long time for the next big idea. In 1793, a man called Claude Chappe invented the long-distance semaphore in France. The French government built a network of 556 relay stations all over the country. These were houses with arms on the roof. The arms could move to make different symbols. Urgent messages could travel at about 20 miles an hour now, faster and much more secure. It was very difficult to intercept and stop the message from reaching its destination. It was in code too, so even if you did intercept it, you couldn't understand it. But the system was very expensive, both to build and to maintain. It was very expensive for the customers who wanted to use it too. But Napoleon used it all the time to send urgent messages about troop movements, how his armies were moving around the country. Why have we looked at these ancient systems? Well, they demonstrate in a simple way 3 basic business principles. Firstly, at the centre of any successful business is a benefit. What does that mean? A successful business satisfies a want. Let me explain. A potential customer wants to do something. In the case of long-distance communication, people simply wanted to send messages to a distant location. This want did not change through thousands of years, but it was met in different ways through the generations. The different ways were faster or more secure or cheaper or more convenient, but they always satisfied the basic want. We can go further. Customers do not buy products. They buy satisfaction of wants. In other words, they buy benefits. Companies sometimes forget this. They try to sell customers products. They give them details of the product. It works at 3 million mega somethings per kilo something. It's got a widget in the thingamabob. But most customers aren't interested in products. You can't sell customers products. Customers want to enjoy the benefit of the product. Now, the Sumerians didn't want writing. The Chinese did not want messengers. The Egyptians did not want horse riders, and the French people certainly did not want semaphore stations waving their arms all over the place. They simply wanted to send a message over a long distance. So that is the first point. Always think about the customer's wants about the needs that your product or service satisfies. Secondly, successful businesses have trained or skilled personnel. The Chinese system had men who knew the way to another town or area. The Egyptian system was more complex. It had horse riders and personnel who looked after the horses at each stop. The French system was even more complex. It had skilled operators who worked the semaphore machinery. The Chinese probably didn't teach their couriers the routes. They knew them already. The Egyptians probably didn't train their horse riders. They employed skilled riders. But the French certainly trained their semaphore operators. So here's the second point. A successful business needs skilled personnel. It either employs them or teaches them the special skills which the business needs. So, to recap, a successful business supplies customers with benefits and employs or trains skilled people. But successful businesses need something else, and this is sometimes out of their control. What is it? Well, the Chinese system needed a road between A and B. So did the Egyptian system. The French system didn't need roads, but it needed buildings every few kilometres to relay the signal. This is the third key element. Most businesses need an infrastructure, a system of roads, railway lines, air routes, sea lanes, plus buildings, shops, offices, warehouses. Now, the Chinese and the Egyptian message businesses didn't build the roads. They were there already. But the French message system needed a new infrastructure system, and the French government agreed to build it. Businesses must work with existing infrastructure, or they must be prepared to allocate scarce resources to new infrastructure. Oh, I nearly forgot. Final, very important point. The semaphore system was very expensive to build and to maintain. Of course, you can spread the cost over all messages, but still each message was expensive. But the system was very fast and very secure. So the government was prepared to pay the high cost. In this case, the government was also a customer, but the principle is the same. If you provide higher benefits, some people will be prepared to pay more for the same basic product or service. Right, so think about the key principles. Benefits, personnel, and infrastructure as we consider the next invention. It's the telegraph. First, I'll tell you how it worked, and then we'll look at how it met the principles. The name telegraph comes from two Greek words, tele, which means distant, and graph, which in Greek means writing. How did the telegraph work? One person keyed in letters on a machine. They travelled as electrical signals to another machine in another town. The second machine printed the letters on strips of paper. Now, mostly the system was used by the railways, so there were telegraph wires between all the stations to carry the messages. But there were problems with the telegraph. Firstly, the letters were in code. It was called Morse code, after the inventor, Samuel Morse. Now, someone had to turn the letters into Morse at one end and decode the Morse into letters at the other end. Secondly, only one message could travel along the telegraph line at one time. And that's like a road between two towns, which can only carry one car at a time. And thirdly, you needed wires connecting each telegraph office. However, in terms of speed, the telegraph was a big improvement on semaphore and, of course, couriers on foot or horseback. The message travelled at the speed of electricity along a wire, which is, of course, the speed of light. Now, in some ways, it was secure because only a Morse operator could decode the message. But on the other hand, the operator read the message before delivering it. So, in that way, it was insecure. So, bearing all that in mind, what benefits did the new system deliver for customers? What problems did it pose for the business in terms of personnel and infrastructure? So, that's how the telegraph worked. Now, how did it meet the principles? Well, first, benefits. It was faster and more secure than the postal system. Oh dear, I see we're running out of time. So let me leave those questions with you. Benefits, personnel and infrastructure for the telegraph. We'll look at the answers next time, and then we'll move on to the telephone and the mobile. Dear me, I didn't get through very much, did I? Well, anyway, you've got the basic principles, and thank you. See you next week.
Lesson 2.3, Learning New Listening Skills. Taking notes onto handouts. Exercise A2, listen and check your answers. A, electrical device. B, Morse code. C, postal system. D, skilled personnel. E, successful business. F, human beings. G, urgent message. (2.7) Pronunciation check. Listen to the pronunciation of some pairs of words. Can you hear the first consonant? 1,
Send messages.
2,
Write letters.
3,
Make progress.
4,
Ask questions.
5,
Eat dinner.
6,
Take back.
7,
Lend money.
8.
Find friends.
(2.6) Exercise C2. Listen and add notes to each slide. Slide 1.
Okay, let's consider the telephone as a business model. Remember, we need to look at three: the benefits of the product or service, the personnel required, and the infrastructure. The fixed line provided lots of benefits over the telegraph. Firstly, fast. In fact, it worked at the speed of light because that is the speed of electricity. And it went straight from the sender to the receiver. You did not need a person to take down the message and then deliver it. And of course, because there was no operator, the system was much more secure. It was years before people learnt how to bug or listen in to telephone conversations. But coming on to personnel and infrastructure, there were drawbacks too. First, personnel. Well, of course, when the telephone was invented, there were no trained personnel. In fact, a new word was coined in about 1912 for people who answered telephone calls and connected people: telephonist. These people had to be trained. The company also had to train linesmen, people who put up the lines between towns and maintained them. They were all men then, but times have moved on a little. Finally, there was no infrastructure. The company needed to build telephone exchanges, another new term. They had to put up telephone lines to link the system together and to lay millions of kilometers of telephone cables, including cables under the Atlantic Ocean and even the Pacific. As a result, the telephone developed really slowly.
Slide 2.
Right, so let's compare the development of fixed-line phones and mobiles. In the process, we will learn an important business principle. First, the fixed-line phone. The device was invented in 1876 by an American, Alexander Graham Bell, but by 1890, there were only 5 million in use, most of them in the US, and even 30 years later, in 1922, there were only 20 million subscribers, that is, people with a telephone. In 1965, the total reached 300 million, doubling to 600 million by 1995, and doubling again to 1.2 billion in the next 13 years. So it took over 130 years to reach this number. What about the mobile? Well, the device was invented in 1973 by a researcher working for Motorola, Martin Cooper. By 1985, there were 340,000 subscribers, which rose to 33 million by 1995. In 2003, just 30 years after its invention, there were 1.5 billion mobiles in the world, more mobiles than fixed-line phones. The figure stood at 4.6 billion in 2010. That's almost one telephone for every man, woman and child on Earth.
Slide 3.
How can we explain the differences? Why did the mobile phone customer base grow so quickly? Was it because of very high benefits to customers? Well, mobile phones certainly have high benefits for customers. For example, you can use them anywhere. You don't call a place anymore, you call a person. But fixed-line telephones probably had higher benefits back in 1876. What about personnel? To what extent did companies need to train personnel? Well, perhaps not as much as the early days of fixed-line telephones, because so much of the system is automatic, so there was a saving there. But in terms of infrastructure, the mobile phone towers, for example, the phone companies had to build everything. So, in many ways, mobile phones had a similar business model to fixed-line phones. But there was one big difference. Mobile phone companies learnt an important lesson from the slow development of the fixed-line telephone. Mobile phones cost about $500 to make in the early days, but companies did not try to pass on that cost to customers. They did not charge customers $500 to have a mobile. In many cases, they gave away the handsets in return for a service contract. As a result, the installed customer base grew very quickly. How could the companies afford to give away their products? Well, they got a service contract in return, and the customers paid regularly for the calls. If a business has more customers, its unit costs, its cost per customer, usually go down. So the installed customer base grew quickly, and the mobile phone companies made money.
Lesson 2.4. Grammar for listening. Ditransitive verbs. Verbs with prepositions. Grammar box 6. Table 1.
New businesses should offer customers better products. Companies give them details of products. They didn't teach the couriers the routes.
Table 2.
New businesses should offer better products to customers. Companies give details of products to them. They didn't teach the routes to the couriers.
Table 3.
Thieves could steal the messages from the courier. Successful companies supply customers with benefits. The machine printed the letters on strips of paper.
Exercise A. Listen to each sentence. Number the 2 objects you hear in each case. 1,
I'm going to ask you a question.
2,
Can you send me a message?
3,
He took a message for me.
4,
They told her the truth.
5,
I'll bring the book to school tomorrow.
6,
Could you lend us some money?
7,
We are going to buy the social sciences lecturer a present at the end of term.
8,
Telephone companies charged customers a lot of money for calls in the early days.
9,
Claude Schaap showed the government his invention.
10,
The semaphore stations cost thousands of francs for the government to build.
Lesson 2.5. Applying new listening skills. The Internet and business principles.
In our last lecture, we heard about 3 key principles of business development: real benefits for customers, skilled personnel, and effective infrastructure. We looked at the case of long-distance communication, where businesses began with a want. But there is another way to develop a new business. We can start with infrastructure and think, what customer wants can I satisfy by using this infrastructure? What benefits can I deliver with this infrastructure? Am I making sense? Well, you can start with a benefit or with an infrastructure. I suppose you can even start with personnel, but that's a bit weird. So this week I'm going to talk about the most important infrastructure of the 21st century. No, it's not the M25 or any other road, and it's not Eurostar or any other railway line. It's certainly not British Airways or Ryanair. It's the international network of computers, which now covers the globe. The internet. First, a brief bit of history, and then we're going to look at the principles of e-tailing, online selling, as opposed to retailing, selling on the high street. Right, so let's get the history out of the way. The internet really starts at the end of the Second World War. In 1945, a man called Bush, no, not that one, or his father. This one is called Vannevar Bush. He had a dream. It must be possible, he thought, to link all information in a library together. His dream went further. Then we could look at the information on a screen. We wouldn't need to go to the actual books or the documents in the library at all. He was only thinking about all the information in one library, but still, for Bush's dream to become a reality, a lot of inventions had to come together. Let's look at 5 of them quickly. Firstly, in 1946, scientists who were working for the US Army built the first real computer. It was called ENIAC. That's E-N-I-A-C. It was enormous, and it only worked for a few minutes before breaking down, but it was the start of the computer age. Secondly, in the 1960s, a man called Ted Nelson invented a name for the connection between documents. He called it hypertext, because hyper means over or extra. Now, we'll come back to this important word later. Thirdly, in 1974, the first personal computer appeared. Several companies claimed the credit, including IBM, of course. The personal computer, or PC, brought the world of computing into the small business and the private home. But these PCs were standalone. In other words, they only worked with the information on their own hard drive. But 1 year later, in 1975, a man called Vincent Cerf, that's Cerf with a C, invented a way for one computer to talk to another computer. Not chatting about the weather, but sending digital data along a wire. The method was called TCP/IP. The P stands for protocol, rules. At that time, the 2 computers had to be in the same place, the same room or the same building. But just 2 years later, in 1977, Dennis Hayes invented the PC modem. This connected one computer to another computer in a different location. And yes, you've guessed it, the connection was through the telephone lines. The name modem means modulator, demodulator, by the way, if you are a computer nerd, but that's just another way of saying encoder and decoder. Modems put digital information into analog form for the telephone lines and turn the analog back into digital at the other end. This was a very important invention, but it was just like the telegraph of 100 years earlier. The connection was like a single road between 2 towns. Only one car could travel on it at one time. Bush's dream was still some time away. Still, by the late 70s, we had most of the parts for the internet, but 2 important pieces were missing. The big breakthrough came in 1990. Tim Berners-Lee was a British scientist working in Switzerland. He had the same dream as Bush. He wanted all the scientists in his laboratory to be able to look at each other's documents, for research, of course, not to plagiarize them. He realized that every document needed an address so you could find the document on another computer. He knew about Ted Nelson's word hypertext. Berners-Lee invented a way of addressing documents. He said, "Dear document," no, he didn't. He called the address HTTP, Hypertext Transfer Protocol. Now, Berners-Lee also invented a simple program called a browser. This program allowed the use of the computer to look at documents on another computer. And hey presto, we had the internet. You see, Al Gore really didn't invent it at all. Berners-Lee's inventions changed the road from one computer to another into a web. Now, this web allowed documents to appear on any computer screen on the internet. Berners-Lee called it the World Wide Web, or WWW for short. Actually, it's longer, but you get the point. Now, before Berners-Lee's inventions of the document address and the browser, the growth of the internet was slow. In 1981, 213 computers could talk to each other around the world. In 1985, that number was 1,961. Just before Berners-Lee's inventions in 1990, the number reached 150,000. After Berners-Lee's inventions, the growth was incredible. By 1991, 300,000 computers could talk to each other. 5 years after that, the number of computers communicating with each other was nearly 6 million. And by 2000, it was 80 million. Today, it's over 4 billion. At first, the internet was not seen as a business opportunity. Now, this is an important point. Write it down. In the early years, it did what Bush and Lee had imagined. It enabled academics to see the information on other computers in universities. But gradually, some business people began to realize that you could market your company on the internet. It didn't cost a lot of money to have a web presence. It was much cheaper, for example, than renting or buying advertising space in newspapers or on billboards. So, in the second phase of the internet, it became a marketing tool. People saw a company on the internet and then went to that shop or restaurant or hotel. And finally, some companies began to see the internet as the shop itself. Why do we need expensive high street premises? They asked themselves. Nobody else was listening. Customers can see our products online and buy them online. Now, can you see the problem for a company which takes this route to developing a successful business? To answer that question, we first have to think about how a normal retailer of books or clothes or whatever works. The company has a high street presence, a shop. Why do they have a shop in the high street? Because that's where customers go. As they say in business, always be where your customers go. Someone goes into the shop, walks around looking at the goods on display, and sees something they want. They talk to a salesperson who is usually a skilled employee. They buy the item and pay at the till, nowadays usually with a card. They take it home. If they don't want it or if there's something wrong with it, they take it back to the shop, and nowadays, in most cases, they can get a full refund. How is an online retailer or e-tailer different? Well, firstly, of course, there is no shop, no high street presence. Instead, there is a web presence. This can be a good thing. As we've seen, customers go to the web in huge numbers, but of course, you have to make sure they come to your site, your e-shop. So perhaps you need to spend some money driving customers onto your site. Secondly, there are no salespeople, no skilled personnel. Again, this may not be a problem if customers can navigate around your e-shop easily. Thirdly, there are no tills. Again, no problem if you have an efficient, secure system for taking payment. Fourthly, you cannot take the goods home with you. The company has to deliver them. So although the company is an e-tailer, using the virtual infrastructure of the internet for marketing, sales, and payment, it still needs to use the real infrastructure of postal delivery to get the goods to you. Finally, you cannot take the goods back. So the company also needs to use the real infrastructure of courier collection to enable you to return the goods. And of course, it needs an efficient system of crediting back the payment to you. Yeah, okay, I see we've overrun again. So I'm going to ask you to do the next bit. Can you research either boo.com or amazon.com and be prepared to talk about the reasons for success or failure at the next tutorial? That's boo, B-O-O, and of course Amazon, you know anyway. Thank you.